Thank you, Jorge. What a pleasure it is to be here with you, Larissa. It's been too long.
Yeah, it really has, Rita.
Yeah.
Such a long time. So nice to see so many friendly faces in the audience as well.
Yeah. I'm excited about this book. When I read it, I couldn't put it down, and I really just love it. So I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for being here with me.
Yeah, of course. There's a couple of things I wanted to maybe just start with, because this novel, it spans from, well, actually, first of all, we'll talk about, I think, the relationship of gathering our own histories in relationship to being on unceded land and trying to think about what we bring to these lands, and doing the homework of understanding our own histories and what we bring here to unceded Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam lands. And I know that for many of us this work is difficult because some of our families don't want to talk about painful histories, trauma, war, the kinds of things that are really hard to talk about that this novel dives into. And the way you've framed it in terms of starting from like 1937 to about 1997, the 60-year frame of time in Hong Kong is like a time that's affected so many of us, and I haven't really had a language to articulate it. So I'm really grateful for the story and the way you ground it in the two sisters, Emily and Violet. But I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what the novel's about for you, from your perspective.
Sure, thanks, Rita. I really appreciate the thoughtful question, and yeah, thanks for thinking about it with me. Maybe I'll just say a word or two about what the novel is about at a very basic level for friends who haven't read it. The novel is about three women, two sisters and a woman who is related to them in various ways over the course of the novel. It starts before the Japanese occupation, so kind of in the thick of the British colonial presence in Hong Kong. And one of the sisters elopes with the son of her father's mortal enemy. Her father is a peddler of an anti-opium medication. You know, this is how Hong Kong comes to be British in the first place, is in the aftermath of 2 opium wars. And so he's ostensibly selling a medication that gets people off opium. In fact, it's an opioid itself, and so it's highly addictive. And so she marries into that family, and there's a whole conflagration that affects the other 2 women in interesting ways, each one. And so the whole first half of the novel is about the sort of how the families reorient their relationships towards one another in the aftermath of this marriage. And there are 3 weddings, so in another way it's very joyful. There's 3 weddings, but they're all complicated and messy, of course. And then the second half of the novel begins with the occupation begins, and so the Japanese Imperial Army invades Hong Kong, and everybody has to deal with a lot of really difficult things, and it radically reorients their relationships to one another yet again. So I'm trying to think about the ways in which, you know, these sort of large occurrences, the big happenings of history, shape the lives of ordinary people. I guess that was the goal of the novel. Rita, okay, you asked me a very complex question in terms of thinking about our relationship here on the land. And just as Jorge was speaking and sort of giving that very thoughtful introduction and recognizing, you know, how badly we're coming up short in terms of the recommendations of the TRC, I'm thinking of a time when we were with Dorothy, actually, at the TRC. I was still living here in Vancouver, and you and I had gone to a number of depositions, and towards the very end of the process, Dorothy asked us if we had also given depositions, and we were both like, no, we're not Indigenous, why would we do that? And she said, remember this, Dorothy? She said, you said, you know, we need to hear from you as well to know, because what has happened to Indigenous people on the whole of Turtle Island affects all of us. And so when you said it, it absolutely made sense, but we hadn't been thinking about it that way. So in a way, I think of this novel as doing that work, of sort of thinking about, okay, well, how exactly have I been affected? But also, what is it, who am I to come to this place with what I'm carrying? What is it exactly that I carry? And the work of this novel, I feel, is kind of trying to make sense of that. So it's something I haven't written about before. It's something I've been sort of trying to write about, probably since my 20s. But the history is it's so much forgotten. And then politically, it's very convoluted and complicated. And within the convolutions of that complication are people's lives, and a lot of pain, a lot of secrets, but also just our lives, right? With all of their joys and sorrows, their wonders and their messes, all of it is entangled in there. And so I really felt like it's important to tell this story, to understand who I am, so I can come here and be here properly. And I feel like the feet are still, it's like my feet have still yet to touch the earth. My feet have still yet to touch the earth. So I was thinking about you a lot, on the work that you've been doing around water, and especially this notion of unsettler that I think you've been kind of thinking about and working with for quite a number of years now. And I find it really helpful because, when these sort of discussions around BIPOC settlerhood first began, they were difficult and painful. We were sort of rolled in with a colonial project in ways that we are indeed part of, but there wasn't a lot of language for how. And so I think that's what I'm trying to do in this book, so that it's a little bit more, there's a bit more of a grounded sense of what that can mean. And then I love the way you put the and the slash, because it gives us agency then, or as our friend Roy Miki would say, right, agency with an S, to make the engagement of working against the horrors of settlerdom while still inhabiting that place, so that it's a term that makes it possible to do the work while one's hands are still dirty, but also while one's carrying one's own, one's own grief, one's own traumas, one's own difficult history.
Yeah, and I mean, Hong Kong is such a unsettling place in so many ways. Like, it's caught between different empires, and you really get the sense in the characters, like, whether we're talking about Japan or Britain or China, like, the idea of connecting to the land itself and the people, like, Hong Kong by and for Hong Kong, I guess, is something that I'm interested in, how there's a kind of live and let live attitude that the characters have, right? That's they understand there's all this ideological manipulation going on, but they still have another way of relating that goes deeper and far beyond that, I would say.
Oh, thank you.
And so I think that also is helpful in terms of what we bring here.
Yes.
Like, to not want, I don't want to pay my taxes to Canada, for instance. I'd rather pay them to the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. So it's trying to think about how to have those kinds of narratives, like, they're possible. And I think your novel, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead maybe to think about how, like, we're at this moment where it's a scary time, and there's a lot of exceptionalism going on of people kind of believing in nation states somehow promoting ideas of superiority over others. But the characters themselves, in their multiracial diversity, in their cultural impurity, their hybridity, all of that, remind us that there's always been a way to relate that is intersectional and not so hierarchical. And I think that is a really important way to remember relating right now in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Like, those histories make other futures possible.
Thanks for reading it so carefully, Rita, and seeing that there's that possibility in the book. It was something very much on my mind, because there's some pretty Grimsbeard stuff in there, and it would be pretty easy, I think, in a story like this to just kind of go straight to grief and hopelessness, because there's a lot of really awful stuff that's just unexpiated, that, you know, is just kind of hanging there in the air and unresolved. But one of the things that I was really interested to do in this novel is recognize Hong Kong as a cosmopolitan place. So it's a cosmopolitan place where people from many parts of the world end up. So people who are there, originally there, people who have come in from China at various different points, carrying with them various imaginations of what China is, has been, could be, but also people from the Caribbean, people from Turtle Island, people from Japan who were not fascist. I mean, I know people from Japan are not fascist, but in that moment, but I mean, in that moment when there was a really strong fascist movement in Japan, there were just ordinary Japanese people in Japan, but also in Hong Kong, curiously, doing all kinds of work, translation work, trade work. And the ways in which that cosmopolitanism comes into being is, it's there, it's present. I think it holds a kind of utopian possibility, but it isn't clean, right? It comes into being through the British colonial presence in the first instance. Not in the first instance, but as the major instance. And then after the Japanese army comes and Hong Kong is occupied, it makes space for another kind of cosmopolitanism. So I don't know if that was present for you when you were reading, but I was trying to think of the bar. So there's a bar in the novel. A large part of the second half of the novel takes place in my imagining of the Hong Kong Cricket Club. And on the bar at that Hong Kong Cricket Club are a range of international people who are able to be there because the Japanese army and the military police, in spite of their brutality, make it possible. And so the difficulty of it is, of course, like there's like, you know, torture, there's mass rape, there's many horrors are unfolding. But to recognize that even behind that horror, there was an anti-colonial and a pan-Asian ideal. And so I'm trying to illustrate the unfolding of that in the midst of that, of the horror, because I guess because you know, partly it's for the next generation. I see my mentee, Elin Wang, who's become a very dear friend in the audience. And I'm thinking of your generation, Elin, and yet the younger, like our younger friends and colleagues as well, who are struggling to find ways to do this work and to be, you know, when one sees something that's ethically not good unfolding, of course we take the moral high ground. Sometimes we have to. But it's also really important to recognize that the positions that we inhabit, I'll say for the sake of this book and this time, as Asian people of color, are also really fraught, right? Like we come here with our hands are not clean. And so we bring our suffering, but we also bring the things we've perpetrated. And it's hard to do that work when one isn't innocent. But I also felt like it was really important to be as precise as possible about the nature of that non-innocence, and also of the utopian possibilities that kind of erupt out of even the most horrific things. And so that's what I think of as happening on that bar in the thick of the occupation.
Okay, I won't give away what else happens at the bar, although there are things I want to say, but I'm going to hold my tongue about the plot. I think, yes, our hands are dirty. However, I think it's also clear in the characters, like they don't want, some of them are forced to do things they don't want to do.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
It's pretty horrific.
It is pretty horrific.
And so I think we have to be really careful to not conflate people with the nations
True.
that
Agree.
are trying to claim them.
Agree.
And co-opt them
Absolutely.
and force them to do things
Yes.
that they don't want to do, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So I guess I'm curious about the characters, because when I was reading, I think I really got into them, and I was curious, like, what were the easiest?
Did you
or
like the
hardest-
characters? Was the story good, Rita?
you're getting better at plot. Hands up, thumbs up. But like I'm into characters. So, anyways, were there ones that were more fun to write or harder to write for you?
Thank you. Thank you for this question. There were some, so at various points, all of the characters were fun. I loved them all. The novel began with Violet, so there's one main narrator, but then other voices do kind of like drop in at various points. I felt like I really needed Violet. So Violet's the older sister, the one who doesn't elope, who just ends up sort of bearing the brunt and making up for all of the things that the naughty sister does. So she's kind of the responsible sister, but she's really cranky about it. So she's responsible, and she's deeply compassionate, and she's also very grumpy. And it was a lot of fun. Writing her grumpiness was a lot of fun, and especially beside all the kind of goodly things she was doing, you know, 'cause she's like picking up the pieces after everyone, like tirelessly and seemingly without complaint. But then 60 years later, she's complaining to the grandniece about it, and it was very fun to kind of inhabit that voice. And then other things that I really enjoyed writing, there's a scene in which Tingyan, who's the third woman character in the novel, she is engaged by arranged marriage to the man who ends up eloping with the other woman. And she's also very unhappy about it and goes to see a fortune teller to lay a curse on the other woman. That was also a blast to write. I really enjoyed, because it was so emotionally tangly, right? And then just to give away a little bit of a plot, it's only a third in, so can I give it away? It's only a third in, it doesn't give away the ending. But she ends up marrying somebody else, and who she doesn't love. And I really enjoyed writing her process, the process of that decision, because these things happen, because there's a certain element of the work of arranged marriage that still enters into that relationship. And it was just really interesting, and I really feel for that character, I guess. I feel for that character. And so it's not exactly fun. It wasn't fun, but there was a certain kind of, pleasure of to try to inhabit what that might have been like, or must have been like, for Chinese women in a very different moment in history, to sort of think about how one might orient one's emotions towards such a possibility. So I enjoyed doing that. There are also two black characters, one mixed race black Chinese character and one black character, who I felt a lot of anxiety about writing. But it was also really important for me that they were there in their voicedness. So fun, it felt important to do. I'm really grateful to Lillian Allen, who gave me a lot of help and support. One is never innocent, obviously, of the things one does when one makes these kinds of narrative choices. But it felt important to me that they were there. And not fun would be the wrong word, but it would just be, it was interesting and meaningful to step into those shoes and try to hear those voices. Yeah.
Because you've got fictional characters and historical characters all mixed in there, right? And I wasn't always clear where the line was drawn, but
right.
I don't think I need to necessarily know that.
I mean, arguably all of the characters are fictional, right? Because I've written, many of them are historical figures, but I can't know what their lives, so I had to sort of fictionalize, and that, I felt a lot of anxiety around that.
Well,
I would like to hear if I got it right or not, if I pitched them fairly. I hope I did.
Well, I mean, I think you must have done a shitload of research.
I did a shitload of
yeah,
research.
right? Do you want to talk a bit about that process?
Sure. So this novel was such a different thing from what, for anybody who knows my previous work, which is a lot of it sort of, slipstreamy spec fiction or else experimentalish poetry. It was really interesting to engage what is essentially a historical novel. And I did feel, and especially in these days of fake news and post-truth and all that, I felt it was really important to be as true to the facts and to history as it is known as I could be. And so I read so much. Popular histories, intellectual histories, memoirs, newspapers from the period. I watched a lot of historical film as well. There's actually, one of the things I will say is that I don't think this novel would have been possible without the internet. Unless I, had a lot of time and a massive grant to visit a lot of places. But now there's so much amazing historical footage. It's just there on YouTube you can watch. So like old tourist videos from the 20s and 30s you can see, and also home movies. So there's one in particular I just really loved. It's just somebody in Hong Kong Harbor who's just filming the boats, and they've got the sound going, and so you can hear the water.
Oh.
And you can hear like the people on the boat shouting, and and it's really amazing because it's the sounds of another time. So that was really cool to be able to access that. And then I also researched music up and down the street. I listened to a lot of music from the period, mostly popular music, both Chinese and Western. And what else did I do? Oh, there was an amazing website called Gulo. It's this Australian guy who has just been collecting like photographs and letters and little sort of amateur memoirs and just all kinds of stuff about the past of Hong Kong. And so I just spent like, I'm sure months of my life just on that website looking at old photographs, maps as well. So I was led to sort of doing mapping work through that website, and then started like digging for historical maps as well, because the geography of Hong Kong has changed a whole big bunch through the whole period that I'm writing. Like they knocked down mountains and pushed them into the ocean. They forbade the growing of rice in Wong Nei Chung village, which is also known as Happy Valley. And so it became a swamp. And then they started pushing mountains into the ocean to extend the land, because the piece of land that was sort of ceded to Britain for the 99-year lease was quite small. And there was a lot of business happening on that land, and they needed the land. So just like knocking down mountains, pushing them into the ocean. And then it would radically reorient the shape of the land. And so looking at maps. And then also Google Maps as well, but just lots and lots of maps. Lots of maps, lots of old photographs as well. One really beautiful thing that happened was as I was trying to think about one of the characters, the Jamaican character, he's mixed race, black and Chinese, who comes to Hong Kong to sell rum and gets involved with radio work. I based him on a historical person, and Nadine Atwell, who's a colleague of our friends at SFU, showed me a letter that she had found in the archive of one of the guys who's involved in the British Army aid group, where this man, Percy Davis Chang, had written to the British government for passage from Hong Kong to Jamaica at the end of the war, just like, explaining his situation, and the British had promised that they would repatriate anybody who had supported them during the war, and they never did. And there's this letter, and it's just heartbreaking. So things like that you come across in the archive. The archive is an amazing place. It's amazing for what's there, but also for what's not there. I don't think I've ever done anything so research intensive in my life. Awesome, one could live there. There's whole lives in there. There's a whole other world in the archive. It's an amazing place.
You know how you were saying about Happy Valley or Wang Nai Chun being turned from rice fields into...
Yeah, there's something else. Okay, ask me.
Well, I mean, there's sort of this British colonial handprint or kind of logic that has reshaped the land in Hong Kong, but it's also reshaped the land here where we're
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And yes, I'm really glad that you're sort of following up on that, because one of the things I also wanted to say was, I don't think I would have figured out to look at the maps and just kind of try to read the shifts in the land if I hadn't been mentored at various points by Lee Maracle. And if we didn't have that story, Goodbye Snouk, that talks about the filling in of False Creek, I wouldn't have known to read a parallel situation in Hong Kong. And it really does make me wonder about sort of British colonial land reclamation, land clamation practices, because there's an interesting parallel there that I was quite conscious of as I was writing it. And so you have like Ophelia's, it's no mistake that Ophelia, who is the novel's great listener, has her flat. It's a False Creek condo, of course, right?
Yeah. I mean, Ophelia works well because we're in Ophelia's position in terms of the contemporary moment, trying to understand the past and being pesky.
Yes.
Right, and asking all these questions and trying to understand what's happened.
I realized very early on that I needed a contemporary listening character in order to kind of order the narrative so that I could write to us in our present moment.
Yeah. I also appreciated the references to W.E.B. Du Bois. I think the character, like, in the letters back and forth between them, because there's that, I don't know, I don't want to call it idealism necessarily, but this desire for justice or equality that I think still continues today in different ways.
He was an amazing man, like just amazing for his activist work, amazing for his intellectual work, amazing for like thinking about the lives of Black people and wanting better. And he also spent a whole lot of time in Asia. And then the interesting thing about Du Bois, I think we say Du Bois because it's the U.S. This is what I was taught to do by my Harlem Renaissance teacher. Don't say Du Bois, say Du Bois. I don't know, whatever. It's all good. Shoot, I lost my train of thought. Oh, he spent a whole bunch of time in Japan in the Pan-Asian moment before the rise of fascism in Japan, and was looking to Japan and thinking, oh, you know, if there's anyone who's going to boot the colonizer out, it's going to be the Japanese. And then the sad thing is, they came, and they did, but the way that they did it was not so great. And so there's a real grief there in the engagement with Du Bois as well. But I think, you know, his interest in the Pan-Asian movement before it became what it became was heartfelt and real, and I'm still moved by it. And then troubled by the way in which it did its work when it came to do its work. But how could he foresee? Nobody could have foreseen that. So he's a really interesting figure. And I read, you know, a vast swath. There's a whole book of Du Bois's essays in Asia. They're very beautiful, kind of trying to think about that relationship. And it seems like really important kind of Black Asian solidarity work to be done by thinking about what he was doing there. But as we do it, we still need to think about the unevenness, right? And the inequities and the entanglements. Yeah.
But I appreciate that there are characters there already interacting in the 30s, you know? It's not something new, like it's been going on for a long time.
The 30s were amazing.
Yeah, and also William Courchain, the code talker, I
guess. Yeah. I haven't talked about Courchain. We've been trying to figure out.
You say potato and I'll say potato.
I'll say Courchain.
Whatever. Okay.
I think you might be right, though. So one of the other really amazing things that I discovered in the research was that there were two Canadian battalions in Hong Kong during the war. One from Manitoba, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, and then another one from New Brunswick. The name has gotten away from me because I didn't write about them. But in the Winnipeg Grenadiers were many Cree and Métis soldiers. Of course, they were, you know, largely from Manitoba. And so that seemed like an important point of kind of contact and relation that is early, that's in the 30s. And so one of the characters is a guy called William Courchain who comes with the Grenadiers. sort of has an Asian look about him, at least the way Violet sees him. And so sort of in the thick of the first day of the invasion, she takes him from the field hospital where there is a terrible atrocity unfolding. She takes him with her along with her sister, to whom, you can read it. And then there's a whole relationship that develops, and he becomes kind of an important part of this cosmopolitan crew of folks from various parts of the world who are in Hong Kong as this moment is unfolding. And for those, I don't know if folks know, but there's I think a really important history of Cree folk who were involved with the Canadian Army and Navajo involved with the US Army, who helped with communications because they used their language to communicate across radio waves so that the Axis side couldn't understand the communications. So it wasn't Cree, like they made a code, they used Cree language and made a code, primarily on the European theater, but there were Navajo code speakers in the Asian theater, and so there's a little bit of that in this novel, through that character.
Is it okay if I quote a little bit from the book?
Quote away.
Okay, because when Violet rescues or helps William and Emily get away from that horrible scene of atrocity, there's something about the Emily character. She's kind of young, and as she matures, I guess we're learning with her. But at one point she says, "If I survive this war, I'll sing. I'll sing my dreams and make them real. I'll find the words. If governments and armies won't think about us, we'll think for ourselves. We'll make a new world for ourselves and the ones we love, dance and sing it into being." And this idea of thinking for ourselves and that world that we want is something that I really keep coming back to, I think, in the novel. And it kind of comes up in different ways. I think there's a moment later in the book where there's a professor figure, and she says she's trying to give you back what the English took from me, that is your own history. And the sense of history being what we have, like, the words for, and thinking about history in terms of going back, to the Tang Dynasty in order to be a free Chinese woman, I think she says at one point. But there's a way in which there's a lot of different ways of thinking that all coexist and don't necessarily try to, in the war, they are often snuffed out. But despite the war, people still keep on finding ways to coexist. So, there's one point where Violet, the sort of grumpy elder, she's like, yes, I know doctors like me are supposed to believe in reason. I believe in reason. That doesn't mean I have to believe in it to the exclusion of everything else, right? Lots of Chinese people believe in more than one thing. I'm no different from the rest of my people. And that ability to believe in many things at the same time, I think, is one of the beauties in the book, I think. One of the ways in which it kind of gives me hope in terms of thinking about how we've survived that lost century. And I guess if you could talk a little bit about the people, I guess, and the way in which the characters exceed that kind of national framing that is so problematic. And I think the novel in a lot of ways is a warning against nationalism.
Thanks, Rita. That's a really thoughtful question. I totally see what you're asking. So, for Emily is a very kind of joyous character. She just wants to live. She's just full of life. She's really a little bit naive. She's a big romantic. She's young. And she's very full of life, and she's cheeky, she's a lot of fun. And what happens to her in the occupation is awful. And yeah, in the wake of that, she comes to this awareness that, you know, the Japanese Imperial Army is fighting for an emperor and for an ideology, and it's the paradox is that there's this pan-Asian dream, and yet all of these Asian people are suffering so profoundly. And it becomes quite clear, I think, in this occupation that it is not about people. Like, people are just disposable. Like, there are many horrors I could name. Should I not? Maybe I won't. They're they're in the novel. I guess just suffice it to say that ordinary people are utterly disposable. And particularly in the moment, so the Japanese invade, there's not enough presence, like British Army presence in Hong Kong. They weren't expecting to be invaded. They thought that the Japanese would go to Singapore, and so they didn't put a lot of people in Hong Kong, and those who were there were not particularly experienced. So they just abandoned Kowloon, like right off the top, retreat to Hong Kong Island. But they don't tell any of the Chinese people in Kowloon. So Chinese people in Kowloon are just decimated. And so this is what Emily is talking about when she says, who cares about nations, who cares about governments? This is garbage. Like, what about the people? We're witnessing a similar thing, I think, happening in Palestine right now. So is it a warning against the nation, though? I'm not sure. The characters are speaking what they're perceiving in the moment. I think my own feelings about whether, I think it's really hard to get away from the nation, Rita, because we're also responsible for things that have happened to our cousins through the nation, right? And if we don't claim the nation, how are we going to take responsibility for the things that we have inherited that have been done in our name? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's very complicated, but a character like Emily could say that. I've sort of lost track of the rest. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think you answered it. I mean, there's a lot going on, basically, and I think despite all of the horror, there's a lot of joy, and I guess what I wanted to honor was just that sense of continuing or perseverance. I think the Arabic would be sumud, but thinking about how everyday people keep materializing that and the stories of the everyday people in the novel. I just got the signal for time, so I'm going to maybe open it up in a minute to audience questions if folks want to ask anything or offer a short comment. But I wanted to maybe ask you how the process of writing this book was different from your other novels, given how the time frame is quite different.
This is my first historical novel, right?
Yeah.
And I've tended to write more in a sort of speculative fiction vein. It was very different because, as I said at the start of this conversation, there was a history to be true to, where when you're writing speculative fiction, you have to build a world, build its history, and then you can tell a story in that space and place. In this case, the space, the place, the history are largely given, but who is at the center of the story is not usually who's at the center of the story. And so that's where the work of the imagination and of kind of recentering still happens. I think you're getting at something else, though. You're asking me about what the point is of writing about history as opposed to writing about the future. I mean, both ways of writing are thinking about the future and what is to come, and both modes are committed to the past as it was, but this one just focuses on that past much more intensely, and then maybe in so doing it gives us a little bit more materially than the speculative work does. Not that the speculative work is amaterial, I think it's still material, but this is maybe more, where that is kind of, the other is sort of dreaming into other times, other places yet to come.
Thank you. I'll have a quick scan of the audience. Would anybody like to ask a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sure, yeah, it's wonderful. It's called Gwulo, Gwulo. And I think it's .com. I'm pretty sure it's .com. No, not a worry.
Yeah, the
It's an
question
amazing
was about
site.
the
Yeah.
website.
It's an amazing
Yep.
site. Clint, yeah.
Thanks, Larissa. I was wondering, you were talking, you like characters and plot and so on. If you want to talk about what you're doing formally, I mean, you're framing narratives? Are you using documents, self-reflection at all?
Oh, sure. Thank you.
So
Thank
the
you.
question is what's happening formally in the novel?
Thank you. So formally, the novel, it is a pretty straight narrative arc. I do commit to plot as it's sort of traditionally understood, like, with a stasis, a rising action, a climax, and a denouement. It does all that. So formally, it does all that. It's still experimental in terms of the way that it's addressing voice. So there's more than one voice. It's primarily Violet speaking, but at various points, Emily comes in, and then so does the father, Cheng. There are other voices in there as well. And sometimes there's also just like a third person limited omniscient, kind of that tracks different characters at different times. So I would say that formally it's not a particularly radical novel. I just sort of felt like there's enough going on without too much formal experimentation. The polyvocality seems to be plenty for an ordinary reader. Are there documents? There's a series of letters. So this is primarily how we get Morgan Horace and Isidore Davis Wong, is through a series of letters to one another back and forth. There are no actual historical documents in it. So it doesn't do any, and in terms of language play, I make up a bunch of pop songs. And that sort of constitutes the novel's kind of poetry. Well, I'm still listening to the work of language because I'm listening for voices. But I would say in terms of like the elements of fiction, I'm playing it pretty straight.
There's also like very short excerpts about the fish.
Short
Right.
excerpts about the fish?
The fish, like kind of when does the fish become human? Like that, it's just a short page.
Oh,
but
that's
it's
Emily talking though.
Is it? I read it as okay.
Oh,
all
you
right.
read it as something else. It's true, she
Okay.
never says, hi, here, I'm Emily. She never does.
She doesn't. All right. Okay. Yeah, because I was thinking about the fish, like the salt fish in earlier novels and then fish
Sure.
in this book.
I seem to love the fish. I seem to need the fish to make a story fly, to make a story swim.
Yeah.
Come on in. We're nearly wrapping. Come on in, have a seat. Sure. Am I allowed to read, Jorge? I'm allowed to read? Okay, sure. I'd be happy to. What should I read, Rita?
Oh. Wow, there's so many choices. Sure. Yeah, if I can find it, I'll tell you the page. Hang on. Maybe 209? Have a look at that and see what you think.
Oh, sure.
I think the date is important.
So it's December 25th, 1941, Christmas Day. It's the day of the invasion. And it's a chapter called When is a Fish Not a Fish? When is a fish not a fish? It's a fish once it's hatched from its tiny, glossy egg. It's a fish when it's swimming in the ocean in a school of other fish. It's a fish as it darts through the coral reef or rides a current down the lip of another continent. It's a fish when it's entranced by a scrap of flesh dangling in the water, and it remains a fish when it's hooked through the mouth. It's still a fish when it's reeled aboard the fisherman's boat. It's a fish when it flaps on a wooden plank in the open air, gasping for water. It's a fish even if it's slapped to death with another plank. It remains a fish when the cleaner slices its belly open and drags the guts out, tosses them back into the water for other fish to eat. It remains a fish when a knife is run against the grain of its shiny, protective scales, dislodging them in long strokes from the follicles until its flesh is naked as a human baby's. It's still a fish when it's tossed into a wok with peanut oil, garlic, and shallots, or steamed in plain water, or dipped in batter and deep fried. It's a fish if it's eaten raw too, as the Japanese do, dipped in shoyu mixed with wasabi. It's a fish if it's torn from bone by knives or human teeth, fish as it's swallowed, fish even as stomach acids go to work digesting it. Only when its fibers are torn down to the proteins, when the eating body incorporates it, when the eating body incorporates into it eating muscle, does it cease to be a fish and become human. There's a little fishy bit.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Clavel's book, Taipan. I took a little boo at it. Sure, I wouldn't say I was influenced. I think I'm doing something really different from that. If I was influenced by other books, I mean, Lung Ping Kwan, the poet's been here a couple of times, and I probably have his poetry in my ear a little bit. There's a Hong Kong writer called Xu Xi, who is really good for like just the dailiness of Hong Kong life in a way that as a second generation person, I would probably have a hard time accessing without her work. And then I did read like a lot of memoirs and historical material from the time. So there's a really interesting biography. It's not a memoir, it's a biography called Small Man of Nanataki about a Japanese Christian minister who was in Hong Kong during the war. And that one was really helpful. And then also, you know, bits and pieces. There's a book about the British Army A Group by the son of Lindsay Ride called Edwin Ride. That one was really helpful. And there's also a history of the war, of the occupation by Philip Snow that I found really useful. So those were the kinds of things that I turned to. Clavel, not so much. I mean, he's sort of interested in that whole Taipan period, which is a little bit earlier. And then, yeah, his heroic figures are very different from mine. He's interested in other people. But yeah, I read a lot of stuff, and for sure, it all finds its way in one way or the other, whether I'm writing into it or writing against it, for sure. How much of a relationship between? Oh,
So the question was the influence
The
in writing The Two Sisters.
right.
Okay.
That just comes out of my head. I was just interested in relationships among sisters. I have a sister, there's two of us. It's not really about me and her, but I guess I think about sisterly relationships a lot. I have sisters in the community as well. Rita's a really important one. So I think about relationships among women a lot. And it sort of made sense for the story, for there to be two. But it's not borrowed. Sometimes I do borrow these kinds of things, but this one is not. Thank you, it's a good question.
Yeah, go ahead. So the question, just because we're recording, is the similarity or difference between writing speculative fiction and historical fiction? Do you feel different writing it?
Oh, that's a really great question. Thank you. Yes, it does feel very different. I mean, as I said just now, part of it is the work. It's the world building work that is like really different in the first instance, because one world is given to you, the other is made up. And so both are labor intensive because one requires a lot of research and the other just requires a lot of kind of imaginative building. Does it feel different? It does, but I don't know how to describe why. Because they're both imaginative, actually. You know, like I can't really know what it was to inhabit, so I do have to do the work of kind of getting inside a character's head and trying to feel and think and embody my way through this, whatever their story is going to be. But it feels different, maybe. That is a really hard question. I don't know the answer. It does. And maybe there's something about, this novel is not about my family, but my family is very much on my mind in this novel. But it's not as though I'm trying to imagine myself to be my mom or be, you know, or my I'm not trying to do that. But it's a really bodily inhabitation of the past that, so it's kind of like doing the work of it. It's kind of like sinking into something when I'm writing historical fiction, where when it's speculative, there's always an element of thinking because you're trying to get into a body that's not your own. Digesting, yeah, it does a little bit. It is a little bit. But when it's future-oriented, I mean, I'm imagining the people who are coming after me, or the people or the extra people, the extra human people who are coming after me. Maybe there's more of an element of flight somehow, maybe. So one is sort of more earth-grounded and the other is more airy, maybe. I don't know. I just made that up. It's an excellent question, but just hard to answer.
Yeah, I mean, we talked earlier when we were preparing about the idea of how the healing of previous generations, when they do it, is done, but when it's not done, the next generation has to carry it, and then the next generation may have to carry it, and so, I mean, I think there's certain things that are being worked out through fiction that are part of that healing, and some of it is intellectual for sure, but some of it is in the body, in the spirit, in the heart, you know.
Yeah, that's so true, Rita, and it's really well articulated. You just said it. Thank you. It's true. Like, I mean, I definitely, you know, it is connected to the work of unsettling, but then it's also just connected to making sense of what it is that we've come out of. And I suppose there is an element of healing. I hope there is. I mean, one of the other parts of this conversation, you know, it's really important to make the recognition that when the elder generations don't tell you things, it's not because they're trying to hurt you. They're trying to protect you, right? It's their way of loving you. It's to not pass on the grief. And so then there's a kind of different understanding of the psyche depending on the culture and the moment. And in the present moment, we sort of seem to think that if you talk about something enough, that you'll heal it. We're inheriting the history of psychoanalysis, right? That if you talk the thing through, that you'll get better. Is that true? Like, I think so, but I don't know. Maybe it's not. And it's possible that maybe we're harming the coming generations by passing it on. So this question of healing, I think, is a really complicated and difficult one. I felt that I needed to do this. Like this felt like the right thing to do in the time that I did it. How will it be read later and remembered? Young folks, I really want to know. And I hope I'm around when you tell us.
Well, okay, one last question, I think. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, Elin, thank you. That's a really great question. So she's asking about the gaps in the archive. So as we're, attending to history, and I was saying I need to be true to what's there on the historical record. But Elin is reminding us that the historical record is always ideological. So somebody, at the various points in time, imagine, it comes back to the question the gentleman asked at the start about James Clavell, and in Shogun, there's one set of heroes, but my heroes are very different heroes, and there are heroes that we don't usually think of as heroic. And in fact, they're so unheroic that their stories are largely not recorded. And so as I'm true to a historical record that is there, it's the historical record of those who had the power and the control of the archive at that time. And now I'm fortunate enough and empowered enough that I have a public voice and the chance to do some writing. And I'm seeking other voices. Elin, I searched up and down the street for those voices, and I found traces. So for instance, there was a medical doctor. She was the first woman to graduate from med school at Hong Kong University. Her name was Lai Po Chin. My tones are terrible. You can ask my mom later to pronounce it right. And so there's just a little record. This woman's there. She graduated from medical school, and she was enlisted into Selwyn Clark's, the name of it's gone out of my head, but there was an organized group of medical people who were permitted by the Kempe Tai to continue to work for both, like for everybody through the colony to maintain health. And so she was involved with that. Is her voice on the archive? No. So, but just the fact that I found her, and then likewise with that Chinese-Jamaican radio man, Percy Davis Chang, so excited when I came across him, because who would have thunk it? So I look for these people, and they appear in places like that website Gulo, or in some of the memoirs as well. Most of the memoirs are soldiers' memoirs, but they talk about who they saw or who helped them on the path. There was one book that was really, really important about the East River Column, so this sort of proto-communist guerrilla group, anti-Japanese guerrilla group in the Saigon Hills, by a scholar called Chen Xiujiang, who was at HKU, who documented the work of that guerrilla group, and that was very unusual and extremely helpful. So I'm constantly kind of looking for people as it's, oh, here's a photograph. Oh, who is this person? Or here's the sound of the water. That's why I loved that film that I found, right? Because it's the water too, Rita.
Yeah,
And listening for the sound of the harbor in another time. And so it's all of these like small voices that weren't considered important, and yet you find little traces of them, like enough to sort of hang your imaginative hat on. And then that's why fiction is so valuable, because it's the one place where one has a measure of permission to make the engagement and kind of dream those beings into being. But of course, it is just my imagination. The voices are actually lost. Like there is actually a hole there. And so the work of filling it in fictively does something, but it's not the same as having those people back. Those people are those beings.
Maybe it's in the realm of dream, right? That it's somewhere alongside us. I also just wanted to acknowledge that the book is dedicated for those to come. And maybe we'll just close with whatever hopes you might have for your future readers.
Oh, sure. I hope my future readers will read.
Oh my God, yeah, hey? Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I tell this story, make this record for a reason, right? That I think we're living in a moment where, a lot of history is being forgotten at precisely the time when we need to remember it. And because we don't remember, I mean, this is kind of a cliche, but it's also true that if we don't remember, we repeat. So that is part of it. But I think beyond that, I also hope that, those who come will continue to read the past and will continue to reimagine it, because as Elin says, there are always things that we forget. There are always the things that we lose, that we don't remember. And so the work of the next generation is to do that work of remembrance and dreaming and reimagination.
Thank you. I think we'll maybe stop here for book signing, and please join me in thanking Larissa.
Thank you so much.